Hello, everybody. Father Scott Vanderveer here with another installment in our series on the beauty of the Eucharist and our 33-day journey toward consecration. I think you have probably before heard the statistic that was quoted by Matthew Kelly in this section of the book. It was found by Pew Research that was done a few years ago of American Catholics. And questions were asked to indicate whether the people who were part of the survey were believers that the Eucharist actually was the body and blood, the soul and divinity of Christ. Or was it more what some people believe, which is a symbol, a kind of memory of the Last Supper? When you receive the Eucharist, are you receiving Jesus Christ truly? Or are you receiving a symbol that represents him, but is not an actual physical manifestation of him in bread and wine form? Is the Eucharist real to you, or is it more of a representation? Now, the first thing I want to say about this is that survey gave us the fascinating response that 70% of Catholics do not have a full belief in the real presence of Jesus in the Eucharist. They feel it is more of a symbol or of an idea. That means that 30% believe that. The thing that makes that interesting is I actually think 30% is quite a bit. 30% of people truly believe something that can only be known by faith. I'm actually encouraged by that. Since when have the crowds been excellent at discerning the ways of God? Since when have we been able to turn to the crowds or popular public opinion to find out what the truth is? How reliable is a survey done on social media about something in society or in the world? Do we really turn to the masses in order to find the wisdom that guides us? 30% of church-going Catholics, in other words, are not just there because they're afraid of not going. They understand there's an obligation and they're worried about the punishment if they don't. 30% are not there because they have a habit or because it's part of the family culture that they grew up in and they can't imagine not doing it. They're there because they believe that each time they receive the body and blood of Christ, they're really receiving the Lord. They're receiving God in this form, and that God then goes into their bodies and makes them up, breaks down into the little parts that make them. Then the Eucharist is in their digestive system and goes through their bloodstream. That means Christ is in their hair follicles, in their nail beds, in the cells of every part of their body. It's an amazing thing to believe. Of course, only 30% believe that. 30% is quite a high number. Now, maybe I sound too overly optimistic about that. Maybe you say, come on, Father, we're talking about 70% of people who go to church who don't believe that. Well, think of Jesus at Holy Week. Think of the passion that we proclaim at Palm Sunday celebrations and Good Friday celebrations. Do you remember the crowd of religious people? Do you remember the crowd? Do you remember when Pilate paraded in front of them? I give you Jesus Christ, your king. And they said, we don't have him as a king. We have no king but Caesar. Caesar? The religious people said that? They did. Then Pilate said, what do you want me to do with your Christ? And they said, crucify him. What? The religious crowds, there for the Passover festival, while the high priests looked on. So then Pilate says, what do you want me to do with your king? Crucify him. Well, why would you crucify your king? He is not our king. We want Barabbas. And you remember the story. Barabbas was a revolutionary, a murderer, a menace to their society. They were so confused that they thought Barabbas was a good guy and Jesus was a criminal. What? So that's the crowds. That's the crowds. For 30% of people to believe that, wow. Here's a question I'd like to ask. Of the people who go to church, what percentage believe that you should do good to those who have wronged you? What percentage believe that that is something they should do and try to do it? What percentage believe that it's right to turn the other cheek? What percentage teach their kids, if someone hits you, don't ever hit them back. Turn the other cheek instead. I don't ever want you to defend yourself in a fight at school. How many people really say that? That's Jesus' teaching. He talked more about that than he talked about the Eucharist, actually. He talked about the Eucharist on this Good Holy Thursday night, the eve of Good Friday, and he talked about it in that amazing extended talk he gave in the 6th chapter of John's Gospel, where he talks about being the bread of life, and all who believe in me will never hunger. So we've got him talking about that, but his teachings on forgiveness and on the last being first and on us, if we're pressed into service for 1 mile, go 2 miles. If someone takes your cloak, give them your shirt as well. All of that, he said, in many of his sermons. It's all over the Bible. What percentage of people who go to church would never imagine not getting revenge because Jesus told us not to? What percentage would never teach their kids that if someone throws the first punch at school, you should drop your hands down and never lay a hand on them, not to touch a hair on their head? What percentage of Catholic families teach their kids that? I'm not here to throw a lot of judgment about that. I think if we're talking about the Eucharist, it's important for us to keep the focus where it belongs. But the Eucharist means that every one of us that has received communion at church not only has received the body and blood, the soul and divinity of Christ. Not only is he in our body, in our cells, in our digestive system, in our nervous system, in our endocrine system, in our immune system. Not only is he all throughout us, but in addition, it means we were there to hear his teachings. And that means he's not only teaching us through words and through our ears, he's actually inside of us teaching us from within. So I think rather than panic that 30% of Catholics believe in the real presence, perhaps we can ask ourselves how we can grow that number to a greater amount. How can we bring more real adult level of engagement to our celebrations? How can we really get people to dig in and not just believe nice things about Jesus by going to church, but by really hearing and wanting to understand his teachings and then put them into practice? If we consecrate ourselves to the Eucharist, we're consecrating ourselves to Jesus, to his way of life, to a Christ-like life. Let's see if we can get more than 30% of us to want that and to put it into practice. Some thoughts for today as we reflect on the Eucharist. May God bless you and your journey now and always.